Hello, my name is Steve Desmond, and I am a candidate for Vice President of UCU from the higher education sector. I'm currently President of Solent University UCU branch, and I'm a long-standing activist in UCU. I've been on the Equality Committee, the LGBT plus committee. I've been chair of the LGBT plus committee. I've twice been elected to the NEC of UCU, running in national election, and I'm a regular attendee at UCU Congress, and I brought multiple motions forward. So some of you will know me from all of that. I'm a Labour voter. I'm on the left. I am a genuinely independent candidate for all members and all groupings. I stand for the rolling back, fundamentally, of the corrosive impact and of marketization in education. I stand for better pay. I stand for strong, secure, government-backed pensions. I stand for removal of student fees. I stand for adequate and imaginative funding for FE and HE by government. I stand for bringing all groups in UCU together through activism on all of these issues that I've just mentioned and discussed. I think that we can work together on better pay, on stronger and secure government-backed pensions, on removal of student fees, on coming together to produce a report that examines funding of FE and HE by government and compares that to the funding models that have been deployed and used in the education sector across many of the developed nations in Europe, to see how we can come up with a new arrangement and a new contract for universities in the UK that prevents the kind of chaos and financial pressures that we're currently witnessing and seeing. Yeah. So I just have some notes written down here, if you don't mind, that I'm going to go through in answer to some of the questions that were put forward, but also to give you a sense for who I am as a person and the kind of beliefs that I have and how I am as a personality, really. I've been teaching in higher education for almost 40 years, across university systems in multiple countries. I stand for a lot of issues. I stand for all of the issues that we've already discussed. I stand for supporting Palestine and Palestinian rights. I stand for climate justice. I stand for, more generally in a society, affordable healthcare and housing for all. I stand for the protection of individual rights and freedoms of all citizens. At Solent University, where I'm president of the branch, we're in a fight for our life. The university is currently trying to 2P all of the academic staff into a sham subsidiary company called Solent University Services Limited. And in so doing, will strip us of our teachers' pension scheme, government-backed pension, and replace it with a vastly inferior private pension. And so, if Solent gets away with doing this, what will happen over a period of time is that this same model will be rolled out in universities across the UK, and we will lose our teachers' pension scheme, government backed secure pension, our pension rights. And that is really just the beginning of a sort of failure in our collective agreements, a failure of so much that we hold dear that is important to us in universities. So we've had our first day of strike action, and it's been the largest day of protest ever on the Solent campus, covered by the BBC, everyone from the BBC to Socialist Worker. Visitors from campuses across the UK came to be supporters on our picket line. That's what I bring in terms of leadership: a media savvy approach, an outreach approach, a campaigning approach, a get the vote out approach. We, only once in our history have ever surpassed the 50% threshold. And that was in 2021, when over 200 staff were put at risk to be laid off. And we only barely made the 51% Whereas this time around, with an exerted kind of campaign, get the vote out campaign, we managed to get a turnout of 72% and with a 98% vote for strike action. So that's the kind of um, you know that's the kind of acumen that I will bring to the role of vice president of UCU. Not least of which are my track record in issues of campaigning and issues of getting the vote out. Okay, I believe fundamentally that as a union and as a sector, we must produce and develop a full and forensic report into funding models in universities in developed countries, looking at issues of pay, comparing the pay across these different societies, student fees, how so many of these societies don't have student fees, how so many of these societies pay lecturers double or treble what we pay them in the UK, how so many of these societies have no student fees, and the government funding models that are applied in those universities. And to understand then the importance that those societies place on education as a vehicle for economic progress and development, and the level at which they're prepared to invest in that sector compared with what is going on in the UK at the moment, which is a system, a semi-marketized system that in terms of it being a funding model and sustaining an education sector which can drive the economy forward is failing in dramatic ways. And I believe that the crisis in education extends beyond jobs, pay, pensions, workloads. Although we must fight with every fibre of our being to defend our collective agreements in terms of jobs, pay, pensions, workloads, etc. Absolutely. That has to be our first port of call, our first kind of emphasis. But what's going on in education, I believe, is also about the collapse of what is happening in real time to whole swathes of our curriculum, the humanities, the creative arts, um, other areas. What is a country and society without history, without English literature, without philosophy? It runs to the core of what we think the education system should achieve and do in society. I teach in Southampton, Hampshire. I often sit in our and teach in our Jane Austen lecture hall. Jane Austen, who lived in Hampshire. Um, I loved English literature in school. We read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, George Orwell's Animal Farm. I loved them all. I devoured them as a 16-year-old. And then came, I remember, Jane Austen's Persuasion. And I sort of looked at that book and saw where it was set and what it was about. And I thought, God, I'm really going to hate this. And but as I turned the pages and was drawn into the stories and got to know the characters, Jane Austen's women, she won me over as a young gay guy coming into early adulthood. I was drawn to her heroines who always stood independently, rejected social conventions and societal strictures, who always forged their own way, and there were always characters who did their own thing in the end. Sometimes they didn't always do that automatically, but in the end they always came to do that, and that was really their kind of salvation. And above all, I suppose, and above all, what appealed to me about her characters was that they insisted on loving who they wanted to love and finding romance in the places where they wanted to find it, regardless of the social norms and conventions of the time. I remember thinking how I had almost how I decided I wouldn't enjoy Persuasion before even reading the book, and how I ended up loving it more than any of the other books that I loved so much that year at the age of 16 and just getting a sense of adult life. I suppose I'm telling this story because over 40 years later, after a long career teaching, I sometimes sit in our Jane Austen lecture hall and enjoy the kind of the quietness. And I think about the state of British higher education. Will Jane Austen's stories be forgotten as they close one English literature department across the country after another? Will her words be erased? Will her characters that speak so much to any young person today about free thinking and independence of spirit simply be consigned to some kind of cultural dustbin? Is that where we are at in higher education and in the education sector in the UK? This is about the death of ideas, the death of debate, of the death of materials that are critical and challenge our social mores. Um, and it runs fundamentally then to what values we hold dear inside of the education system. We must, inside of our education system, be able to produce people who can drive society to be better, to be more compassionate, more creative, and more financially bountiful indeed, to drive the economy. We can't afford to lose our humanities. We can't afford to lose our creative arts. We can't afford to lose our drivers of critical self-expression and critical awareness. As Vice President of UCU, I will fight for teachers. I will fight for FE and HE institutions. I will fight for keeping the power of ideas and debate at the center of our curriculum, at the center of our education sector. I remember the day that I got my first teaching job, my first full-time teaching job at the age of 30 at the City University of New York, and how I walked out that day after I had been told that I'd gotten that job. It was a kind of an arduous process to get there, and how elated I was as I walked home, that I would get to do what I'd always dreamed of doing, which was to teach. I loved my students, just as I do now. Back then, I loved my students when I started out, just as I do now. I dedicated myself to students, just as I do now. But I would say, like many teachers in 2025, 2026, I do really resent the current reduction of teachers and lecturers to the status, really, of circus chihuahuas dancing the high kick can for NSS doggy treats. And I use that language consciously. And it is a kind of hyperbole. It's true. But I want us to think about how this system takes teachers who are already so dedicated, who cared so much about their students always, and somehow poisons that idealism that brought so many teachers into education by subjecting them to operate inside of a system which simply calibrates and measures everything that they do in an incredibly reductive way for the purposes of statistics and a survey. We went into education to serve our students, to be of service to our students, to give everything for our students, but not to dance for NSS doggy treats. I stand for rolling back the corrosive impact of marketization in education and finding again our idealism in education, our belief in education, our optimism in education. I very humbly ask for your vote for the position of Vice President from HE of the University and College Union. Thank you very much.